Hello everyone, thank you for joining us yet for another edition of fortnightly IRENA Insights webinar series. My name is Martina Lyons and I'm from the IRENA Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn, Germany. Due to poor internet connection, today we will not be using cameras, just that you know. So this is our short and sharp webinar series of 30 minutes when we deep dive into one of the hot topics of the energy transition. And the idea is to share with you key insights from our latest work report and tell you where you can find more information on the website if that topic also piques your interest. So today, while you enjoy your coffee, tea, or bagel in the next 30 minutes or so, we will hear from IRENA Senior Analyst Michael Taylor, the key insights from the IRENA annual Renewable Power Generation Cost Report. The report was launched today, just a few hours ago, and Michael will share with us key takeaways from that report, particularly the latest trends in installed cost, capacity factors, and levelized cost of electricity for a full palette of power generation technologies. And he will also touch upon battery storage and for the first time, the solar thermal heat for industrial processes. So a lot to unpack here, but before I hand over microphone to Michael, just a few housekeeping items to cover. You all know about them from all the other online events, but still, we are recording the webinar and the recording and slides will be available on IRENA events website. We are also all muted or on mute, and if you have questions for Michael, use the question function. And don't forget to give us your feedback through the short survey after the webinar. So without any further ado, let me welcome Michael. Michael, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Martina, for that introduction. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today to present the work of our team here on the latest Renewable Power Generation Cost Report. So I have a lot of material, so lots of interesting things to discuss, but as Martina said, this is going to be a very quick run through to give you an idea of some of the high level results and interesting analysis that we've done that you may like to examine in more detail at your leisure with the PDF. So this is the part of essentially a series of work. I've had the pleasure of working with IRENA since 2012 on the cost analysis, and all of our reports are online. And unfortunately, at this moment, today's data or report for the data file that accompanies the report is not online, but that will be going up in the next few days. But all of our material is online. This represents the culmination of a lot of work we've done to collect data over the years. So we have a very rich data set, and it wouldn't happen without the great team that I have. So Pablo, Roland, and Sonia Alzagul have been working with me around the clock to get this done. We've had great support from our partners, as you'll see, assisting with some of the analysis, particularly on solar thermal heat, but also, we've benefited from the insights of, the entire energy community in some respect, and we're thankful to those that took the time specifically to review the report. So, as I said, we've been collecting this data for quite some time, and we now have a database of around 20,000 projects, which we have project level total installed costs and capacity factors, which allow us to calculate a levelized cost of electricity. We complement that with a PPA and auction database where we have information around PPA prices, possible indexation, and the length of the contracts, which complements that project level database of total installed costs and capacity factors. So for those of you that have been following these reports for some time, a quick overview of what's new. Very importantly, we have new WACC assumptions, weighted average cost of capital. So we've reduced the weighted average cost of capital by 2.5% through time. So in 2010, we now assume 7.5% in the OECD and China and 10% elsewhere. And that reduces through to 2020 to 5% in OECD and China and 7.5% elsewhere. There's more analysis on this in the report, and we're doing a survey of financing costs, which will inform next year's report and allow us to have country and technology specific WACC assumptions. So these are, if you like, an interim result, but they do have an impact on the cost trends, obviously. We also, as Martina mentioned, have data for the first time on solar thermal heat for commercial and industrial use. We have some new cost performance and performance metrics for power generation, and much more coming in the second half of this year, but not actually showcased in this report. We include some information on behind the meter battery storage cost trends, and look a little bit at hybrid solar PV storage pricing and the role that potentially CSP plays, but I'll talk about that in a minute. And we did a little piece looking at some of the implications of the falling costs of renewable power generation. And it has really been a decade of decline. So this report highlights that, you know, the world really is in one where renewables are the least cost source of new electricity generation. And indeed, last year, over 60% of all utility scale capacity added had costs lower than the cheapest alternative fossil fuel fired cost option. And costs have not just been falling, but as we'll see, they're even at absolute low levels. And that means that we're increasingly undercutting, new renewables are increasingly undercutting even existing coal. At the same time, you know, this has significant implications for the energy transition as a whole. So low cost renewable electricity it's now quite clear, will be the backbone of the electricity system, but electrification is becoming an important part of the energy transition. In 2020, you know, renewable capacity additions were at a record high, and really it was a bit of a bright spot in what was a difficult or indeed traumatic year for many people. So between 2019 and 2020, the cost of electricity from solar photovoltaics fell by 7%, offshore wind 9%, onshore wind 13%. And concentrating solar power, we cheated a little here. This is the compound rate over 2018-2020, which is 16% per annum. There's been a erratic deployment in the last couple of years, and it's been very swingy, but you can read about that in the report and about why we've smoothed that average. In terms of the analysis over the decade 2010 to 2020, this chart shows the levelized cost of electricity. Each circle represents an individual project that's been commissioned in that year. The diameter is its size in megawatts. The lines that link 2010 and 2020 for each technology, the global weighted average is in each year. The bands that you can see around each of the years and technologies are the 5th and 95th percentile of projects. And finally, the grey band across the entire bottom of the chart is the fossil fuel fired cost range. What we can see for bioenergy, geothermal and hydro, they offer costs of electricity at the lower end of the range. Not the same, obviously, learning by doing opportunities for the emerging, or well, I guess it's difficult to say that now, but the newer technologies of solar and onshore and wind. And you can see here very dramatic reduction for solar PV, 85% fall between 2010 and 2020, right to the bottom of the fossil fuel fired cost range. And as you can see, with many projects undercutting that significantly. Concentrating solar power is the least deployed of all the technologies on this chart, with only around 6 gigawatts globally. In that respect, the cost reduction to within the fossil fuel fired band is indeed actually quite remarkable, even if we'd like to see it go further. Offshore wind has almost halved in terms of the cost of electricity over the last decade, and is now a really established and competitive technology. Onshore wind technology improvements, as we see, continue to make this a very competitive source of new electricity generation. And the weighted average in 2020 is quite low because of the very high share of China's contribution to that total. We also have the PPA and auction database, and you can see here what happens when we overlay the two. So the auction database is in orange and the LCOE database is in blue. There's a number of caveats around interpreting the auction and PPA prices compared to levelized cost of electricity. There are issues around the boundary conditions not necessarily being the same. Most of the data in this chart has been corrected to resemble an LCOE value to the extent possible, and we've excluded specific outliers that would distort that. And it shows the continued competitiveness of the new projects being competitively procured in the next couple of years, particularly for solar PV. But with the remarkable growth in deployment, we're actually seeing a little bit less of our database coverage coming from PPA and auction results. And part of that is around the difficulties in actually getting some of these results as well. So what we've seen in the levelized cost of electricity declines over the period we've looked at is quite significant. Here you see again the last year's value and the total reduction over the period 2010 to 2020. So very significant cost reductions. These are rather remarkable rates of cost deflation, and you won't see these kinds of values in any other ordinary basket of goods that makes up, for instance, the consumer price index. So it's really quite a remarkable trend. And the learning rates for these technologies are very high, actually. So the learning rate, for those of you not familiar with it, is the percentage reduction in the cost or price for every cumulative doubling of installed capacity or production. And you can see here the curves on the left-hand side for concentrating solar power and offshore wind. So we're plotting the levelized cost of electricity and PPA and auction prices, the global weighted average by year. And you can see that there is a very sharp rate of learning for both the solar technologies and somewhat less for offshore wind, and onshore wind is somewhere in between. Now, in terms of the actual values, you can see here that in terms of total installed cost, utility scale solar PV, the learning rate is for the period 2010 to 2020 is around 34%. And for the LCOE, it's 39%. So relative to the other technologies, and we'll see this in a minute, utility scale solar PV, the cost reductions have been driven predominantly by reductions in total installed costs. The other technologies have benefited more from technology improvements which have increased capacity factors. And we'll see that in the results as we walk through the detailed chapters, summaries. So as I mentioned, we've not just seen falling costs, but these are now at absolutely low levels. And you saw for solar PV and onshore wind significantly undercutting, say, 5 cents per kilowatt hour. So in fact, over the 10-year period, 644 gigawatts of renewable capacity was deployed that had lower costs than the cheapest new fossil fuel-fired option in that year. Most of that initially, of course, was hydropower. But since around 2015, we've increasingly seen onshore wind in that mix. And in recent years, the last 3 years, solar PV in significant numbers as well. And overall, last year, around 62% of the capacity added from renewables was actually at a lower cost than the cheapest fossil fuel-fired option. obviously, if we have absolutely low levels of pricing for renewables and continuous declines in many markets, there's an increased risk of stranded assets. And we've done some analysis to update others' excellent work and notably Carbon Tracker's work on coal-fired power plant marginal costs, but also vibrant clean energy in the US and a number of other sources. And we've updated this. And you can see here our estimate of the current operating costs only for coal-fired plant and lignite plant in Germany and Bulgaria. And the dotted lines you see there, excuse me, the dotted lines you see there are the country-specific PPA or auction results for delivery in 2021. And this includes obviously the most recent data we have for coal costs, but also the capacity factors over which these plants are operating, which is based on 2020 data. And you can see that none of the plants appear to have operating costs only lower than new solar and wind capacity in Germany and Bulgaria. We did this analysis as well in detail for the United States and India, although a little bit more tricky for India to update the values as comprehensively. So this is probably a little generous actually for India because some of the capacity factors are probably lower than what we've got here. And you can see here that the absolute cost level of coal production, operating costs only, are lower in the United States and India. Obviously, the fact that they don't face a significant or a meaningful cost of CO2 has a big impact on that. But their competitive situation is also rather precarious because these two countries have very competitive solar PV and onshore wind costs. And you can see that in general, 70 to 80 or even 90% of the current coal plants in these countries may have operating costs higher than new solar and wind. So, there's a number of caveats to this, and cost is not equal to value, and the capture prices tend to rise as capacity factors for coal plants fall. But you can see here that there's a significant wedge opening up, and there look to be increasing numbers of coal plants at risk. We had the pleasure of working with Solreco and Babel Epp through the solar payback scheme to collect data for the first time on solar thermal for commercial and industrial sectors. This may become part of a separate series of reports on cost of renewable heat. And we have around 1,750 of these larger projects, totaling around 935 megawatt hours. You can see here the data, the total installed cost on the left, and on the right, the levelized cost of heat at a 5% weighted average cost of capital. For district heating systems in Denmark, and we have over 100 of these in the database. And you can see there's quite steady decline through time. Denmark's a relatively mature and competitive market for solar thermal district heating systems. And those cost curves actually represent, for the total installed cost, actually represent a learning rate of around 17%, which, if you remember from my early slide, is very close actually to onshore wind. So very interesting results coming from this data. It's just a snapshot in the report at the moment, but later this year we'll release a full report with all of the data analyzed. I mentioned earlier that we've also included some information on behind the meter battery storage cost trends. Just before talking about that, it's very difficult to get comprehensive data for utility scale battery storage, but the US Energy Information Administration obliges companies to provide that to them, and costs fell 71% in the space of a very short period there, as you can see. On the graph itself, what we have is behind the meter battery storage cost trends. And you can see for Germany, coincidentally, actually the total cost, the weighted cost, fell by 71% as well, but for a longer time period here for these small scale residential systems. We were also fortunate in that the European Commission supported some work that has allowed us to survey for results in Italy, France, and the UK, and we are thankful to our partners in Solar Choice in Australia providing us with their data. And you can see that Australia is a little bit more competitive. Italy and France, say, more expensive than Germany, and the UK, very similar, it would seem. So interesting data, and we hope to expand our data collection for these for battery storage technologies going forward. But battery storage has a little bit of a limit, and we'll see that when we talk about this chart in a little bit more detail. This is a chart of, on the left-hand side, solar and predominantly solar and battery storage hybrid systems, and the PPA or auction price that has been discovered from for those projects. On the bottom left is a cluster which includes Portugal, India, but mostly data for the United States, and that's on the mainland in the US. And you can see values range from as low as about 2.8 cents up to about 4.5 for most of the projects, or $27, $28 per megawatt hour. The cluster above that is Hawaii, but those projects are actually very competitive compared to the diesel-fired generation costs that they face in Hawaii. The limit here between 4 and 15 hours is a little bit the challenge of battery storage. It's very economic now as costs have been falling, but batteries have an effective economic limit of about 4 hours. And on the right-hand side, you can see the auction result for the DEWA, Dubai Electricity and Water CSP project, 700 megawatts, which will be coming on stream this year. And you can see that although the cost is a little bit larger, it really stands out in terms of bridging that gap in terms of storage duration and getting you daily storage, as indeed does solar thermal actually, when you're talking about heat with thermal energy storage. So very quickly, a skim through the results by technology. Before I move on to the solar and wind technologies, very quickly on hydropower, bioenergy, and geothermal. The mature technologies, well established, don't forget about them just because we're not talking about them. They're important. They provide, in many cases, low cost, dispatchable power that can help support variable renewable energy integration. So quickly through the technology, solar and wind technologies, you can see here from left to right chart of the total installed cost trend, the capacity factor, and the levelized cost of electricity from left to right. These are the global weighted averages, and the range you see highlighted is the 5th and 95th percentile of projects commissioned in that year. So as you've seen, a very steep fall in total installed costs, which is somewhat a fraction lower than what we've seen in the levelized cost of electricity, as there has been some growth in the capacity factor. Most of the growth in the capacity factor you see through to, say, 2018-19 was because a shift of deployment to areas with higher on average solar resources. That reversed a little bit in 2020, but this result is a little bit open to revision because of the increasing importance of single axis trackers and bifacial modules, which raise yields. And there's a significant lag in the data collection there, so that value might be revised upwards in next year when we have more data available. Over the life of the, our experience from 2010, solar PV modules prices have dropped by 89 to 95%, depending on the specification. So this has been one of the main drivers of driving down the total installed cost of solar PV, whether it be utility scale or residential or commercial. There has been as you may be aware, there's been some tightening in the supply chains in the recent months, and there's prices have actually blipped up. So, you know, solar and wind technologies may be a mature commercial solution, but that doesn't, you know, insulate them from the supply and demand imbalances in the supply chain. So we've seen an uptick there, and it remains to be seen for how long that continues, given the very large plans for expansion of upstream capacity in the sector. But it will definitely have an impact on 2021 numbers. And it's not just total install module prices and inverter prices that fall on. Balance of system costs have also come down. So what we've seen is a very rapid reduction for the markets where we have time series data of around 77 to 90%, depending on the market, between 2010 and 2020. Markets with shorter time horizons tend to have slightly lower rates of reduction. There's been a narrowing of the cost differentials between countries in the last, say, 4 or 5 years, but that remains significant. And here you can see the total installed cost breakdown, which we collect for the G20, and I'll show you in a moment for some new countries this year as well. And you can see that there's a factor of around 3 between the lowest installed cost in India, which is very competitive, just under $600 per kilowatt, and say Japan and the Russian Federation, where costs are significantly higher, and a whole range of countries somewhere in between. So despite this convergence that I was talking about, there's still, you know, a reasonably large difference between a number of countries, and you can see here that the structural reasons for those cost differences actually vary quite a bit depending on the market. So it's very interesting to have this data available. And we're very happy this year to add to this collection of data more countries in Europe, but also hidden away here, you can also see Chile. There's a little bit of a flatter for most of the countries here, there's a little bit of a flatter curve, but still, again, quite significant cost differences between technologies. Overall, in terms of the 85% reduction in utility scale solar PV LCOE on the global weighted average level, modules and inverters accounted for around 55% of that reduction. So significant reductions, obviously, from the balance of system costs, some from the reduction in weighted average cost of capital, reductions in O&M, and so on. But it's predominantly for solar PV a story around the reductions in total installed costs, which is not the case for onshore wind, because we've seen quite significant improvements in the performance of wind turbine technologies. And so you can see here a chart which shows on the x-axis the nameplate capacity, and on the y-axis the rotor diameter, and from bottom left to top right, you see the movement for each of these countries between 2010 and 2020. So a very significant increase in, on average, turbine capacity rating, but also the rotor diameter. And larger hub heights with higher hub heights with larger swept areas mean that today's wind turbines can harvest more electricity from the same wind site than yesterday's technologies. And so what we've seen is that despite challenges in accessing good wind resource sites, most countries have experienced quite a significant increase in capacity factors through time, particularly in the last decade, although it's a little bit trickier to tell from this chart because we have For onshore wind, we have time series data going back quite some time. At the same time, total install costs have obviously come down. And here you can see the wind turbine pricing from a variety of different sources, and on the bottom, China, which has a different cost structure. They exclude the towers from their pricing, so they're a bit different. You can see that's come down, but again, tightness in the supply chains have seen prices tick up late in 2020 and into 2021. So that will have an impact on projects, for instance, that have reached financial close this part of the year. So of course, if you have total install costs that are falling, capacity factors that are increasing, then the levelized cost of electricity is falling. And we can see that over the entire period for which we have data. This is the global weighted average. And between 1983 and 2020, you see that very significant cost reduction, an almost linear cost reduction in the cost of electricity, say for the last 7 or 8 years. With wind turbine prices pricking up, that may be a pause in that in 2021 results, but we won't know till this time next year. Offshore wind, as I mentioned, has really come of age in this last decade from being an expensive niche technology at the early stage of commercial deployment, really not niche, but at the early stages of pushing down the cost curve. And we can see on the left-hand side, again, total install cost, then capacity factor, levelized cost of electricity. And we can see that in between 2010 and 2015, costs were relatively, total install costs were relatively stable, but since then they've come down quite quickly as the market has matured, notably in Europe. In 2020, part of the reduction is the result of the very high share of China in deployment. So they actually rose their share to around half of global deployment last year, and so their lower cost structure has obviously helped pull down 2020 values. In terms of trends, again, it's a technology story around the turbine, but also shifting further offshore and into deeper water. So you've got the water depth on the x-axis, the average distance from shore on the y-axis, and the deeper blues are the more recent projects. At the same time, again, like onshore wind, we've seen turbine sizes increase, and very rapidly in the last few years for commissioned projects. At the same time, economies of scale in actual overall wind farm have been unlocked, because we've seen since around 2012 quite large average sizes. And as you can see, this time allowing to see the difference between Europe and China more clearly. We've seen costs come down significantly in the last few years in Europe, with a little change in China, to be honest. Concentrating solar power, as I said, only 6 gigawatts of deployment to date. Again, the same 3-panel chart. This is a very nice example of declining install costs, rising capacity factors, and falling LCOEs. The market is very thin in 2020. Only 2 projects were completed in China. So, similar to the period that we have in 2010 to 2014, where Spain dominated the market. 2020 is very much a year dominated by the Chinese national circumstances. But what you can see here is that as we've shifted to higher areas with better solar resource and added more storage, so cost reductions and technology improvements, which has lowered the cost of thermal energy storage, mean that we've got higher average storage durations for the more recently commissioned plants. And you can see that on the chart on the right. And higher storage durations mean you're utilizing the power block for longer hours of the year and higher capacity factors. And as we saw, that the cost of electricity has come down as a result. You can see here just how sparse the number of projects are, though. It would be great to see more support to CSP, as we saw earlier, because of its ability to have low cost, long duration storage to support variable renewable technologies. So very quickly, what are some of the implications of the very low cost of renewable electricity? I've mentioned already the fact that low cost electricity is clear that it's making renewables the backbone of the electricity system, but with decarbonized renewable electricity, you can also look at direct electrification and obviously indirect electrification, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But before we do, it might be worthwhile to talk about some of last year's headlines. So last year we saw four maybe, say, significant announcements of auction or tender results in the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, all significantly below 2 US cents per kilowatt hour. In the past, we would have considered this improbable, but actually looking at the numbers, if everything is really shifted to its best level of settings, some of these values may actually be representative of levelized cost of electricity. So if we start with, say, a reference plant for 2021 with $550 US per kilowatt, remembering that the average in India last year was slightly below 600, and then we start, pushing the LCOE inputs to their best levels, we start to see the cost of electricity fall. And so those 1.6 cents per kilowatt hour in the United Arab Emirates down to around 1 cent per kilowatt hour in Saudi Arabia actually may be feasible in some places. It may mean that the project developer is not responsible for all of the grid connection costs. They may be having some of the safety and security O&M costs met by the host, etc. But assuming a 30-year life for the project, which is now increasingly being done, low O&M costs of say $6,000 per kilowatt, which is $6,000 per megawatt per year, which is a couple of thousand below Indian values today. US $450 per kilowatt, as I said, if they're not paying for grid connection charges, this helps. They're large projects, so they might have economies of scale that reduce the project development costs as well. And a very low WACC of 1.9% real. Then we can see these very low values happening. And that changes things a little bit when we think about hydrogen. So obviously in recent years, there's been a lot of, with the reduction in costs for renewable electricity and the possibility of using renewable hydrogen becoming, the forefront, if you like, of finding that bridge to decarbonizing some of the hard to decarbonize sectors. There was a bit of a presumption that would take some time, but these very low costs in Saudi Arabia, when combined with some, reasonable but obviously low values for the electrolyzers, we could see a situation where very low cost electricity makes hydrogen and say the 1.6 to 1.7 US per kilogram of hydrogen feasible in, say, a location like Saudi Arabia. If you can have, say, 1 cent per kilowatt hour electricity from solar PV and 2 cents from onshore wind. So Saudi Arabia, a couple of years ago now, also let a tender for the Dumat Al Jandal wind farm at slightly under 2 cents per kilowatt hour. So if we take those input assumptions, 1 and 2 cents per kilowatt hour for solar PV and onshore wind, $750 per kilowatt for the electrolyzer and the other assumptions on the right-hand side, you can see that if you connect to the grid only to sell electricity in this case, not to purchase electricity to make hydrogen, then it pays to oversize your PV system because it's such low cost, and you get this combination of solar and wind allows high full load hours, optimizing the amortization of the electrolyzer cost. If we go into the future, say, with lower electrolyzer costs, then the situation changes, and you can see in the middle here that accepting lower load hours on the electrolyzer becomes feasible because of the electricity, because the cost of the electrolyzer is not such a burden on overall costs. So very interesting results, and that range 1.6 to 1.7 falls firmly within the range the International Energy Agency has estimated for the cost of steam methane reformed hydrogen with CCS from natural gas. I think of $1.4 to $2.4 per kilo. So very encouraging, very interesting to see the results that drop out from that analysis. So I've talked an awful lot, and I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Michael, and for a lot of interesting insights, a lot of positive news in the report year by year, and this report is really impressive. As we ran out of time, I will apologize to the audience for skipping the Q&A section, but you can still hear the recording will be online, and you can download also the presentation and the report online. The database will come in a couple of days, so hopefully that's enough. If you have any questions, you can always reach to Michael. He shared his email address on the website. So I would like to thank you, Michael, for your time and for sharing with us key takeaways from today's report. And also, I would like to thank all of you for joining us today, for joining us today, for listening, and we hope that you learned something new and that you will join us again in the next 2 weeks for our next edition of the webinar. Well, thank you, and goodbye, and see you soon.